She was forced to eat from the cafeteria floor while everyone watched, calling her a freak and a vampire. Then the new kid did something no one expected. He sat down right beside her and joined in. What she didn't know was that this one act of solidarity would change both their lives forever. The smell of overcooked meatloaf and disinfectant hit Jackson Reeves like a brick wall as he stepped into Crestwood High's cafeteria for the first time. His mom had warned him about starting senior year at a new school, but she hadn't mentioned the jungle of cliques, whispered gossip, and territorial lunch tables that stretched before him like a battlefield. Jackson grabbed a tray, his worn leather jacket creaking as he moved through the lunch line. The cafeteria lady with the hairnet gave him a once-over, clearly sizing up the new kid with his messy dark hair and the kind of smirk that screamed trouble. He loaded his tray with whatever looked edible and scanned the room for somewhere to sit. That's when he saw her. In the far corner, near the windows that cast long shadows across the checkered floor, sat the palest girl Jackson had ever seen. Her skin was practically translucent, making her dark hair look like spilled ink against fresh snow. She hunched over her lunch tray, picking at what looked like a sad salad, completely alone at a table meant for 8. But she wasn't going to stay alone for long. Well, came a voice that dripped with a kind of fake sweetness that made Jackson's teeth ache. Look what crawled out of her coffin today. 3 students approached the pale girl's table, led by a blonde whose spray tan looked like it had been applied with a paint roller. Behind her strutted 2 boys, one built like a linebacker, the other tall and lanky with the dead eyes of someone who enjoyed other people's pain. Madison, the pale girl said quietly, not looking up from her salad. Can't you find someone else to bother? Oh, but Nix, you're just so much fun, Madison cooed, sliding into the seat across from her uninvited guest. Besides, someone needs to teach you about proper lunch etiquette. Jackson paused halfway to an empty table, his curiosity piqued. There was something about the way the pale girl, Nix, apparently, held herself. Like she was holding back something dangerous. Her knuckles were white as she gripped her plastic fork. See, normal people don't eat weird rabbit food, Madison continued, gesturing to Nix's salad. Normal people eat normal food. But then again, you're not exactly normal, are you, freak? The linebacker, whose Letterman jacket read Derek, reached over and flicked Nix's water bottle off the table. It hit the floor with a plastic thunk that echoed through the suddenly quiet corner of the cafeteria. Oops, Derek said, his grin revealing teeth that belonged in a shark documentary. Nix's jaw tightened. Just leave me alone. But we're trying to help you fit in, the lanky kid said, his voice nasally and grating. See, Tyler here has a theory that you might actually be happier eating with the other animals. You know, down where you belong. Before Nix could react, Tyler swept his arm across her tray, sending her salad, apple, and milk carton crashing to the floor. Lettuce scattered across the dirty tiles, and milk pooled around her black combat boots. There you go, Madison said, standing up and smoothing her perfectly pressed skirt. Now you can eat like the freak you are. Go on, get down there and eat off the floor like a good little vampire. The cafeteria had gone dead silent. Every conversation stopped. Every fork paused halfway to waiting mouths. This was the kind of spectacle that would be talked about for weeks, the kind that would define Nix's reputation for the rest of the school year. Nix stared at the mess on the floor, her pale hands trembling slightly. For a moment, Jackson thought he saw something flicker in her dark eyes, something that made the hair on his arms stand up. But then her shoulders sagged in defeat. That's when Jackson made the decision that would change everything. Hold my beer, he announced loudly, even though he was clearly holding a carton of chocolate milk. Every head in the cafeteria swiveled toward him as he walked over to Nix's table with the casual confidence of someone who had never met a situation he couldn't make worse. Madison and her cronies looked confused as Jackson set his tray down on their table. Actually, Jackson said thoughtfully, picking up his milk carton, I don't have a beer, but this'll do. Without breaking eye contact with Madison, Jackson tilted his chocolate milk and poured it directly onto the floor next to Nix's spilled lunch. The brown liquid splashed across the tiles, mixing with the puddle of white milk in a gross, abstract art piece. "What are you doing?" Madison demanded, her spray-tanned face flushing an unnatural orange. "Well," Jackson said, settling down cross-legged on the cafeteria floor right in the middle of the mess, "if she's eating down here, then I'm eating down here. House rules, right?" He reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a granola bar, unwrapping it with exaggerated care. "Besides, I've always been more of a floor person myself. Better acoustics down here. You can really hear the gossip echoing off the walls." The cafeteria erupted. Some kids were laughing, others were taking pictures with their phones, and a few were just staring in open-mouthed shock. Jackson took a massive bite of his granola bar and chewed thoughtfully. "You're insane," Derek said, taking a step back as if Jackson's crazy might be contagious. "That's what my therapist keeps telling me," Jackson replied cheerfully. "But she also said I have boundary issues, so really, who can you trust these days?" Madison looked around the cafeteria, clearly realizing that her power play had backfired spectacularly. Instead of humiliating Nix, she'd created a circus, and Jackson was the ringmaster. "This is stupid," she hissed, grabbing Derek and Tyler by their sleeves. "Come on, let's go somewhere that doesn't smell like freaks." As the three bullies stalked away, their dramatic exit somewhat ruined by Derek slipping slightly on the spilled milk, the cafeteria slowly returned to its normal volume. But the stares continued, and the phones kept recording. Jackson finished his granola bar and looked up at Nix, who was still standing frozen beside her overturned chair, staring down at him with an expression that mixed confusion, anger, and something that might have been gratitude. "So," Jackson said, brushing crumbs off his jeans, "I'm Jackson. New kid. And you're Nix, right? Cool name. Very mysterious and gothic. I like it." Nix blinked slowly, as if she was processing what had just happened. You didn't have to do that." "Do what?" Jackson stood up, offering her a napkin from his pocket. "Make a fool of myself in front of 300 people? Trust me, that's just Tuesday for me. Wait until you see what I do for an encore." "They're going to make your life hell now," Nix said quietly, accepting the napkin and dabbing at the milk on her boots. "They don't forget." Jackson shrugged, his smirk never wavering. "Good. I was worried this place might be boring." For the first time since he'd been watching her, Nix's lips twitched upward in what might have been the beginning of a smile. But just as quickly, her guard went back up, and she looked away. "I should go," she murmured, grabbing her backpack. "Hey, wait," Jackson called after her as she headed for the exit. "What's your next class? Maybe we can walk together. You know, compare notes on our newfound social pariah status." Nix paused at the doorway, looking back at him with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Why?" she asked. "Why what? Why did you do that? Really? Nobody does that." Jackson tilted his head, considering the question seriously for the first time since he'd sat down in the milk puddle. "I guess," he said finally, "I really hate boring bullies. And Madison? She's the most boring kind of all." Nix stared at him for a long moment, then shook her head. "You're going to regret this," she said, but there was something softer in her voice now. Something that sounded almost like hope. "Probably," Jackson agreed. "But I regret most things I do anyway, so at least this time it's for a good cause." As Nix disappeared into the hallway, Jackson looked around the cafeteria. Students were still staring, still whispering, still pointing at the puddle of mixed milk on the floor. A janitor was approaching with a mop and the kind of resigned expression that suggested this wasn't his first rodeo with teenage drama. Jackson grinned and gave the room a theatrical bow. Thank you. I'll be here all semester. Don't forget to tip your lunch, ladies." As he walked toward his next class, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just started something much bigger than a cafeteria incident. There had been something in Nix's eyes when Madison called her a vampire, something that suggested the insult might not be as far from the truth as everyone assumed. But that was a mystery for another day. Right now, He had to figure out how to survive the rest of his first day at Crestwood High as the crazy new kid who ate lunch off the floor. Somehow, though, he was looking forward to it. The next morning, Jackson barely made it through his locker combination before a pale hand slammed against the metal door, trapping him inside the narrow space between lockers. "We need to talk." Nix's voice was low and dangerous, nothing like the quiet, defeated tone from yesterday's cafeteria disaster. Up close, Jackson could see details he'd missed before. The way her dark eyes seemed to catch light that wasn't there, the unnatural stillness of her breathing, the fact that she moved without making a sound. "Good morning to you too, sunshine," Jackson said, grabbing his chemistry textbook without seeming bothered by her intimidation tactics. "Love what you've done with the whole mysterious threat thing. Very dramatic. Library." Now she stepped back, but her posture remained coiled like a spring ready to snap. "Can't. I've got Jenkins for first period, and that man takes attendance like it's a sacred ritual." Jackson slammed his locker shut and shouldered his backpack. "How about lunch? We could sit on the floor again. I'm thinking of making it a tradition." Nix's jaw tightened. "Fine. After school. Library. Don't make me come looking for you." She melted back into the crowd with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years avoiding notice, leaving Jackson wondering if he'd imagined the whole encounter. But the faint scent of something floral and cold lingered in the air. Definitely not imagined. The library at Crestwood High was a relic from the 1970s, all orange carpet and wood paneling that had seen better decades. Jackson found Nix in the back corner, surrounded by stacks of books that looked older than the school itself. She didn't look up when he dropped into the chair across from her. "So," he said, keeping his voice library appropriate, "this is cozy. Very secret meeting in the shadows aesthetic. Are we plotting world domination or just comparing homework notes?" "Why did you do that yesterday?" Nix demanded, finally meeting his eyes. Her voice carried an edge that made something primitive in Jackson's brain sit up and pay attention. "Do what? Eat lunch?" I know the granola bar was a bold choice, but... "Stop," she leaned forward, and Jackson caught another whiff of that strange, cold scent. "You humiliated me. In front of everyone. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Jackson blinked, genuinely confused. "Humiliated you? I thought I was helping. You know, solidarity in the face of spray-tan tyranny and all that. You made me into a joke." Nix's whisper was fierce enough to make the dust motes in the afternoon sunlight seem to shiver. "Everyone's talking about the crazy new kid and his pet freak. They're taking bets on what you'll do next. And that's bad." Nix stared at him like he'd suggested they set fire to the building. "Of course it's bad. I was invisible before. Invisible is safe. Invisible means they leave me alone except for the occasional lunch tray incident. But now..." She gestured helplessly. "Now I'm part of whatever circus act you're running." Jackson leaned back in his chair, studying her face. There was real fear there, under the anger. Not fear of embarrassment or social rejection. Something deeper. Something that made her hands shake when she thought he wasn't looking. "Look," he said, his usual grin fading. "I'm sorry if I made things worse. I really am. But watching those 3 brain donors humiliate you for sport? That wasn't okay either." "You don't understand." Nick started, then stopped abruptly as voices echoed from the library entrance. "Told you she'd be here," came Derek's voice, too loud for the sacred quiet of the library. "Freaks always hide in the dusty corners." Madison's laugh was sharp and cruel. "Perfect. Time for round 2-inch." Without thinking, Jackson grabbed Nix's arm. "Back exit." She shook her head. "Dead end. Storage room." The footsteps were getting closer, weaving between the stacks with predatory patience. Jackson could see Madison's blonde hair through the gaps in the books, Tyler's lanky frame following behind like a loyal scarecrow. "Trust me," Jackson whispered, standing up suddenly and raising his voice to normal volume. "So that's when I told the police officer, 'Sir, that's not my ferret, and I have no idea how it got in the principal's coffee pot.'" Madison rounded the corner just as Jackson launched into an elaborate story about ferret-related chaos at his old school, complete with dramatic hand gestures and sound effects. Within minutes, he had Derek snorting with laughter and even Tyler cracking a smile. Wait, Madison interrupted, clearly frustrated that her intimidation mission had turned into story time. We didn't come here to listen to your stupid. Oh, but this is the best part. Jackson continued, completely ignoring her. See, the ferret had somehow learned to operate the espresso machine, and when Principal Morrison took that first sip, he made an explosive gesture that sent Derek into full-blown guffaws. By the time Jackson finished his completely fabricated tale, a small crowd of students had gathered, drawn by the laughter. Madison found herself surrounded by an audience that was more interested in Jackson's ridiculous story than whatever mean-spirited entertainment she'd planned. This is stupid, she finally snapped, grabbing her cronies. Come on, we'll deal with you freaks later. As the bullies retreated, muttering threats and looking thoroughly deflated, Jackson turned back to Nix with a satisfied grin. See? Sometimes you fight boring bullies with boring them to death. Though technically, I think I won them over with my natural charm and wit. Nix was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. That story wasn't true. Not even a little bit. Made it up on the spot, Jackson shrugged. I've never even seen a ferret in real life. But Derek doesn't need to know that. Nix shook her head slowly. You're insane. So you keep telling me. But hey, it worked, didn't it? For a moment, Nix almost smiled. Then her guard snapped back up, and she gathered her books with sharp, efficient movements. Stay away from me, Jackson. I mean it. Whatever game you're playing, whatever kick you get out of chaos, find someone else to use as your entertainment. She was halfway to the door when Jackson called after her. It's not a game, Nix. And you're not entertainment. She paused without turning around. Then what am I? I don't know yet, Jackson admitted. But I'm pretty sure you're worth finding out. When she left without another word, Jackson remained in the library, surrounded by dusty books and the lingering scent of something cold and floral. He was beginning to suspect that Nix's secrets ran much deeper than social anxiety and goth fashion choices. And despite her warnings, he was more curious than ever. Coach Peterson had the kind of whistle that could wake the dead and the personality of a drill sergeant who'd had his coffee spiked with pure caffeine. When he announced dodgeball for Thursday's gym class, the collective groan from the students could probably be heard in the next county. All right, maggots, Peterson barked, his clipboard clutched like a weapon. Team captains are Rodriguez and Chen. Pick your warriors. Jackson found himself on Chen's team, naturally gravitating toward the back row where the less athletically inclined students tried to make themselves invisible. Nix stood at the far end, already resigned to being picked last, her gym clothes hanging loose on her pale frame. I'll take the vampire girl, Derek called out when it was his turn to pick, his voice dripping with mock enthusiasm. She looks fast, from all that running away she does. Madison cackled from the sidelines, having conveniently forgotten her gym clothes and earning herself a spot as scorekeeper. Make sure she doesn't bite anyone, Derek. Nix's shoulders tensed, but she walked to Derek's team without a word. Jackson watched her face carefully. That same dangerous flicker he'd seen in the cafeteria was back, barely contained behind her dark eyes. This should be fun, Tyler muttered, bouncing a red rubber ball in his hands like he was planning to use it as a weapon. The game started with the usual chaos of teenagers hurling rubber projectiles at each other with more enthusiasm than skill. Jackson quickly established himself as a menace, targeting Derek with the kind of precision that suggested he'd spent considerable time practicing the fine art of annoying people. Hey, meathead, Jackson called out, launching a ball that caught Derek square in the chest. Catch. Derek hit the bleachers with a satisfying thud, his face red with embarrassment and rage. You're dead, new kid. Promises, promises, Jackson replied, already reaching for another ball. What started as playful antagonism quickly escalated. Tyler whipped a ball at Jackson's head with enough force to cause actual damage, missing by inches only, because Jackson ducked with reflexes that impressed even himself. Derek, back in the game after catching someone else out, began targeting Jackson with the kind of intensity usually reserved for professional sports. Enough! Coach Peterson's whistle shrieked across the gym. Rodriguez, Chen, control your animals, or I'm making everyone run laps. But the damage was done. Derek and Tyler had worked themselves into the kind of fury that made teenage boys do incredibly stupid things. As the game resumed, they abandoned all pretense of playing dodgeball and focused entirely on trying to pummel Jackson into submission. That's when Nick stepped in. "You're going to get yourself killed," she hissed, appearing beside Jackson with that unsettling silent movement of hers. "Probably," Jackson agreed, dodging another ball aimed at his skull. "But I'm taking them down with me. It's all about the principle of the thing." "There is no principle. You're just—" Nix cut herself off as Tyler wound up for what looked like a pitch worthy of the major leagues. "Duck." Instead of ducking, Jackson did something that defied both logic and physics. He dropped into a crouch, spun on one heel, and somehow used Tyler's own momentum against him, sending the lanky bully tumbling across the gym floor in a tangle of arms and legs. "What the hell was that?" Nix demanded, staring at Jackson like he'd just performed actual magic. "Oh, that?" Jackson straightened up, grinning despite the fact that Derek was charging at them like an enraged rhinoceros. "My uncle taught me some moves. He called it anti-vampire combat, but honestly, I think he just made it up to keep me busy during family reunions." "Anti-vampire." Nick started, then had to dodge as Derek barreled past them, slipped on the polished gym floor, and crashed into the equipment cart with a sound like cymbals being dropped down a staircase. Jackson demonstrated another move, this one involving what looked like a backward somersault that somehow ended with him launching 3 balls simultaneously at different targets. It shouldn't have worked, but it did, taking out the last of Derek's team in a display that was equal parts ridiculous and effective. "Your uncle is either a martial arts master or completely insane," Nick said, and for the first time since he'd known her, she was trying not to smile. "Why can't he be both?" Jackson replied. "Uncle Eddie always said the best defense against supernatural threats was to be so weird they couldn't predict what you'd do next." Nix's almost smile faltered. "Supernatural threats. You know, vampires, werewolves, the usual family paranoia stuff. Uncle Eddie was convinced our small town was crawling with monsters. He spent my entire childhood teaching me defensive maneuvers that mostly involved confusing the enemy with interpretive dance and strategic use of household objects. And you believed him?" Jackson shrugged, helping Tyler to his feet with a kind of casual friendliness that probably made the bully question everything he knew about social dynamics. "I was 8. He gave me cookies and taught me how to fight imaginary monsters. What's not to believe?" The whistle blew, signaling the end of class, but Jackson noticed that Nix was staring at him with an expression that went beyond curiosity into something that might have been recognition. "Jackson," she said quietly as they walked toward the locker rooms, "your uncle. Did he ever mention anything specific about vampires?" "Oh, tons of stuff. Garlic, crosses, wooden stakes, the whole Hollywood package. Plus some really weird things about emotional control and family seals," and he stopped, noticing the way Nix had gone perfectly still. "Why?" For a moment, he thought she might actually answer. Then her guard snapped back into place, and she shook her head. "Nothing. Just curious." But as she disappeared into the girls' locker room, Jackson caught her reflection in the gym's mirrored wall. Or rather, he caught what should have been her reflection. The mirror showed the empty space where she'd been standing, nothing more. Jackson stood frozen in the middle of the gym, staring at the mirror, his uncle's ridiculous stories suddenly seeming a lot less ridiculous. "Well," he muttered to himself, "this explains a few things." Behind him, Derek was still untangling himself from the equipment cart, muttering threats that seemed a lot less important now that Jackson had bigger mysteries to solve. Like how he'd somehow managed to befriend an actual vampire. The final bell rang through Crestwood High like a death knell, and Jackson had never been more grateful for the end of a school day. Chemistry had been a disaster involving accidentally creating what Mr. Peterson called a small but concerning explosion, and his English teacher had given him detention for Wednesday after he'd somehow turned a discussion about Romeo and Juliet into a debate about whether vampires could truly love mortals. He was shoving books into his locker when he heard it, the sound of someone being slammed against metal, followed by Nix's voice, strained but defiant. "I said no, Madison." Jackson's blood ran cold. He grabbed his backpack and headed toward the sound, weaving through the emptying hallways until he found them in the west corridor, far from the main exit where teachers might still be lingering. Madison, Derek, and Tyler had Nix cornered against a bank of lockers, but this time they'd come prepared. Derek held what looked like a spray bottle filled with something that made Jackson's nose burn even from 20 feet away, while Tyler gripped a wooden dowel that had been sharpened to a crude point. "See, freak," Madison was saying, her voice sweet as poison honey. "We've been doing some research. Turns out there are ways to deal with your kind." "My kind?" Nix's voice was carefully controlled, but Jackson could see the tension in every line of her body. She was pressed against the lockers like a caged animal, her dark eyes darting between her attackers and the makeshift weapons. "Don't play stupid," Tyler sneered, waving the wooden stake in front of her face. "The no reflection thing? The way you don't eat real food? The fact that you're pale as a corpse and cold as ice." Jackson's stomach dropped. They knew. Somehow, these three walking brain cells had figured out what he'd only just realized himself. "You're insane," Nix said, but there was something in her voice that sounded like fear for the first time since Jackson had known her. "Maybe," Derek said, raising the spray bottle. "But we're about to find out how much you like garlic, aren't we?" That's when Jackson made his move. He didn't charge in heroically or try to fight three people at once. Instead, he did what he did best. He caused chaos. "Fire. Fire in the building," he screamed at the top of his lungs, sprinting down the hallway while pulling the fire alarm with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of strategic panic. The shrill wail of the alarm filled the corridor instantly, followed by the automated voice announcing an emergency evacuation. Emergency lights began flashing, and the hallway that had been empty seconds before suddenly filled with teachers and students rushing toward the exits. In the confusion, Jackson grabbed Nix's hand and pulled her away from her attackers, who were too stunned by the sudden chaos to react immediately. They pushed through the crowd of confused students, Jackson leading them toward a side exit he'd scouted on his first day. "This way," he shouted over the alarm, pulling Nix through a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" that led to a maintenance corridor he discovered during his chemistry detention. They ran through the narrow passage, their footsteps echoing off concrete walls, until they reached an emergency exit that opened onto the student parking lot. The cool afternoon air hit them like a blessing after the claustrophobic hallway. "Are you insane?" Nix gasped, leaning against the brick wall while trying to catch her breath. "You just pulled a fire alarm. They're going to expel you." "Better expelled than watching you get staked by the Three Stooges," Jackson replied, checking the door to make sure they hadn't been followed. "Besides, I've been expelled before. It's not that bad once you get used to it." "They had garlic spray," Nix said quietly, and for the first time, her voice sounded small and vulnerable. And they knew about the mirror thing." Jackson turned to face her, his usual grin replaced by something more serious. "Yeah, well, they're not the only ones who figured it out." Nix went perfectly still. "What do you mean?" "I saw you in the gym mirror today. Or rather, I didn't see you." He kept his voice gentle, non-threatening. "Want to tell me how long you've been a vampire? Or should I start guessing?" For a moment, he thought she might run. Every muscle in her body was coiled for flight, and her dark eyes held the kind of panic that came from having your deepest secret exposed. But then something in her expression shifted, and she sagged against the wall. "How did you know?" she asked. "Besides the mirror thing? You don't eat real food. You're cold to the touch. You move without making sound, and you smell like winter even in September. Jackson sat down on the concrete steps, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. Plus, Madison called you a vampire on my first day, and you looked guilty instead of confused. I'm not supposed to tell anyone, Nick said, sliding down the wall to sit beside him. My family, they made me promise. Your family knows. They're the ones who did this to me. Well, not the vampire part. That was an accident when I was little. But they're the ones who sealed most of my power away. She wrapped her arms around her knees, making herself small. They said it was to protect me, to help me live a normal life. And the bullies figuring it out. Changes everything. Nix's voice was flat, defeated. If word gets out, if the wrong people hear about it. There are others like Derek and Tyler, but worse. Much worse. People who hunt vampires for sport. In the distance, they could hear sirens approaching, fire trucks responding to Jackson's false alarm. Soon the school would be swarming with first responders, and questions would be asked. We should go, Nick said, starting to stand. Wait, Jackson caught her arm gently. Those three idiots, they're not going to give up. You know that, right? They'll keep coming, and next time they might actually hurt you. I can handle myself. Can you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looked like you were about to let them do whatever they wanted rather than fight back. Nix's jaw tightened. I can't fight back. If I lose control, if the seal breaks, I become something else. Something dangerous. And then the real hunters will come. The sirens were getting closer. Soon they'd have to run. But Jackson needed her to understand something first. Look at me, Nix, he said. When she met his eyes, he smiled. Not his usual troublemaker grin, but something warmer and more genuine. I don't care what you are. Vampire, human, or something in between. But I'm not going to stand by and watch people hurt you. You don't understand what you're getting into. Probably not, Jackson agreed. But I'm getting into it anyway. As they ran toward the woods behind the school, leaving the chaos of fire trucks and confused students behind them, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the treeline, someone who'd been tracking unusual activity at Crestwood High and had just gotten very interesting footage of a vampire and her human protector. Saturday afternoon found Jackson standing outside Retro Palace, arcade that looked like it had been transported directly from 1985 and forgotten by time. Neon lights flickered in patterns that probably violated several epilepsy warnings, and the sound of electronic beeps and bloops drifted through the glass doors like a digital siren song. He checked his phone for the third time in 5 minutes, wondering if Nix would actually show up. After Thursday's hallway incident, she'd been even more withdrawn, slipping through school like a ghost, and avoiding him with the dedication of someone who'd made it an art form. But then he'd cornered her after last period on Friday with an offer she couldn't refuse. One afternoon of normal teenage fun. No supernatural drama, no bullies, no deep conversations about your existential vampire crisis. Just you, me, and some seriously outdated video games. She'd stared at him like he'd suggested they go skydiving without parachutes. Why would I want to do that? Because, Jackson had said, when's the last time you did something just because it was fun? The long pause that followed had been answer enough. Now, watching her approach the arcade with the cautious steps of someone entering enemy territory, Jackson couldn't help but grin. She'd actually come. I can't believe I let you talk me into this, Nix muttered as she reached him, tugging at the sleeves of her black hoodie, like she was trying to disappear inside it. Believe it, vampire girl. Today, you're going to experience the ancient human ritual known as having a good time. Jackson pushed open the doors, releasing a wave of synthetic carpet smell and the distant sound of someone losing badly at Street Fighter II. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of competitive chaos. Nix turned out to be surprisingly good at air hockey, her supernatural reflexes giving her an unfair advantage that Jackson countered with increasingly ridiculous trash talk and what he claimed were strategic psychological maneuvers, mostly involving making funny faces at crucial moments. That's cheating, Nix said, but she was almost smiling as she slammed the puck past his defenses for the 5th time. That's not cheating, that's innovation, Jackson protested, doing a little victory dance despite losing. Besides, you're the one with superhuman speed. I'm just leveling the playing field with superior comedic timing. They moved on to racing games, where Jackson's lead-foot driving style clashed spectacularly with Nix's precise control, resulting in spectacular virtual crashes that had them both laughing harder than either had in months. Okay, Nix gasped, wiping tears from her eyes after Jackson's car had somehow managed to flip itself upside down and drive backwards through the finish line. How do you even do that? Natural talent, Jackson said proudly. I'm gifted at finding new ways to fail spectacularly. For the first time since he'd known her, Nix looked genuinely relaxed. The constant tension that seemed to live in her shoulders had melted away, and when she laughed, it was with her whole body instead of the careful, controlled sound he'd heard before. That's when everything went sideways. Well, came a voice that made Jackson's good mood evaporate instantly. Look what we have here. Derek stood in the arcade entrance, but he wasn't alone. 3 older guys flanked him, college-aged, wearing leather jackets and the kind of confident smirks that suggested they'd never met a problem they couldn't solve with violence. Friends of yours? Jackson asked Nix quietly, but her face had gone pale enough to make her usual complexion look tan by comparison. Hunters, she whispered, the word barely audible over the electronic din of the arcade. The oldest of the newcomers stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Nix with a kind of intensity that made Jackson's skin crawl. Nix Ravencroft, you're a hard girl to track down. Marcus, Nix said, her voice flat and dead. I should have known Derek would call in the professionals. Your little pet human here's been causing quite a stir, Marcus continued, his gaze shifting to Jackson with obvious disdain. Fire alarms, public displays, drawing attention to our kind of work. That's not very considerate. Our kind of work? Jackson asked, stepping slightly in front of Nix despite having no idea what he was getting himself into. Pest control, one of the other hunters said with a grin that showed too many teeth. Specifically, blood-sucking pests who think they can hide in high schools. The arcade had gone quiet around them, other patrons sensing trouble and either moving away or pulling out phones to record what looked like it was about to become very entertaining. Challenge time, Jackson announced suddenly, his voice carrying across the arcade with theatrical enthusiasm. You guys look like you think you're pretty tough. How about we settle this like civilized people? Marcus raised an eyebrow. And how's that? Dance Revolution Tournament. Best out of 3. Winners take all. The silence that followed was so complete that Jackson could hear the distant sound of someone's Pac-Man game ending. You want to settle a supernatural conflict with a dance game? Derek asked, his voice cracking slightly. Why not? It's got style, it's got flair, and nobody has to get their leather jackets bloody. Jackson spread his arms wide, addressing the growing crowd of onlookers. Besides, what's more embarrassing, losing a fight or losing to a teenager at DDR? What followed was possibly the most surreal 20 minutes of Jackson's life. He bought them time, but not much, and the hunters were getting increasingly impatient with his ridiculous challenges. Marcus had drawn the line at attempting the claw machine. This is beneath us, and his patience was clearly wearing thin. Enough games, Marcus finally said, his hand moving to something concealed inside his jacket. Time to end this. That's when the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a second later, bathing the arcade in eerie red shadows, and in that moment of confusion, Nix grabbed Jackson's hand and pulled him toward the back exit with superhuman strength that nearly dislocated his shoulder. They burst through the rear door into the alley behind the arcade, but the hunters were right behind them. Jackson could hear Marcus shouting orders, coordinating a search pattern that suggested this wasn't their first supernatural hunt. This way, Nix hissed, pulling him toward the maze of back streets that led toward the old part of town. As they ran through the gathering dusk, Jackson couldn't help but notice that Nix was moving faster than any human should be able to, and her grip on his hand was cold enough to numb his fingers. So, he panted as they ducked into an alley. On a scale of 1 to completely screwed, how much trouble are we in? About an 11, Nix replied, checking around the corner for pursuit. Marcus doesn't give up. Ever. And now that he knows about you, he'll come after me too. He'll use you to get to me, or kill you to send a message. Hunters aren't known for their mercy toward vampire sympathizers. In the distance, they could hear the sound of engines starting up and voices calling out search coordinates. The hunters had vehicles, organization, and apparently enough experience to track them through half the city. Any ideas? Jackson asked. Nyx was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening streets. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. There's a place we can go. Somewhere they might not follow. But Jackson, she turned to look at him, and her eyes held something that might have been an apology. If we go there, if I show you what I really am, there's no going back. You'll be part of this world whether you want to be or not. Behind them, the sound of pursuit was getting closer. Jackson squeezed her hand. Lead the way. The old river path wound through crustwood like a forgotten secret, hidden beneath overhanging willows and century-old oak trees that had watched the town grow around them. Nyx led Jackson along the muddy bank with sure steps, her night vision guiding them through shadows that would have been impenetrable to human eyes. They'd been walking for 20 minutes when she finally stopped at a small clearing where the river curved around a cluster of moss-covered boulders. Ancient stone benches, cracked and weathered, suggested this place had once been a formal garden, now reclaimed by nature. Here, Nyx said, settling onto one of the stone benches. They won't follow us here. Why not? Jackson asked, looking around the seemingly ordinary clearing. Because this place is protected by something older than vampire hunters. Nyx's voice carried a weight that made the air itself seem to shiver. My family's magic runs deep here. It's where they performed the sealing ritual when I was 12-inch. Jackson sat beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough to give her space. Tell me about it. All of it. For a long moment, the only sound was the gentle murmur of water over stones. When Nyx finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he had to lean closer to hear. I wasn't born a vampire. I was turned when I was 7, an accident during a family camping trip. A rogue vampire, one who'd lost control completely, attacked our campsite. My parents tried to protect me, but she touched a barely visible scar on her neck. By the time they killed him, it was too late. Your parents fought a vampire? My family has been dealing with this supernatural world for generations. Not hunters, but guardians, I guess you could call them. They protect the balance between human and vampire worlds. Nyx pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself small. When I turned, they could have staked me, followed tradition. Instead, they spent 5 years researching a way to let me live. The sealing ritual. They bound most of my vampiric nature away, locked it behind magical barriers that would only break if I lost complete control or she hesitated. Or what? Or if I chose to break them myself. Nyx turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting starlight like dark mirrors. But if that happens, if I become what I really am, every hunter in 3 states will sense it. They'll come for me, and they won't stop until I'm dead. Jackson processed this, connecting dots he hadn't even realized were there. That's why you never fight back. Why you let Madison and her crew walk all over you. You're not weak. You're terrified of becoming too strong. If I lose control, I could kill someone without even meaning to. And then the hunters would be right. I would be a monster. The sound of breaking branches made them both freeze. Through the trees, Jackson could see the beam of flashlights cutting through the darkness, getting closer. Impossible, Nyx whispered. The protections should keep them out. Maybe your family's magic isn't as strong as you thought, came Marcus's voice from the treeline. Or maybe we brought something stronger. The hunters emerged from the shadows. Marcus, his 2 companions, and Derek, who was clutching some kind of electronic device that beeped steadily. Vampire tracker, Marcus explained, noticing Jackson's confused stare at the device. Military grade. Your girlfriend's sealed power still gives off a signature, just fainter than usual. She's not my girlfriend, Jackson said automatically, then immediately regretted it as Nick shot him a look that could have frozen fire. "Doesn't matter," one of the other hunters said, raising what looked like a crossbow loaded with wooden bolts. "Both of you are loose ends now." That's when Jackson felt it, a change in the air pressure, like the moment before lightning strikes. Nyx had gone perfectly still beside him, and when he glanced at her, her eyes were no longer reflecting starlight. They were glowing with it. "Nyx," he said quietly. "Don't. They're going to kill you," she whispered, and he could hear something inhuman creeping into her voice. "They're going to kill you because of me." The sealing marks on her arms, faint scars he'd never noticed before, were beginning to glow with the same pale light as her eyes. The temperature around them dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds. "I can stop them," Nyx continued, power building around her like a visible storm. "I can make sure they never hurt anyone again." "And then what?" Jackson asked, somehow managing to keep his voice calm, even as frost began forming on the stone bench beneath them. "You break your family seal, every hunter in the country comes after you, and you spend the rest of your life running. Better than watching you die." Marcus was shouting something about containing the situation, but Jackson tuned him out. This moment, this choice Nyx was about to make, was more important than whatever the hunters were planning. "Hey," Jackson said, reaching out to take her freezing hand. "Remember what you said about your family being guardians? About protecting the balance? That's not me anymore. I'm just a monster they tried to fix." "No, you're not." Jackson squeezed her hand, ignoring the way the cold was making his fingers numb. "You're someone who's been so afraid of becoming a monster that you forgot you could choose to be a hero instead." The glow in Nyx's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Jackson thought he'd reached her. Then Marcus made the mistake of aiming his crossbow at Jackson's chest. "Time's up, bloodsucker. Release the human and come quietly, or watch him die." The sealing marks on Nyx's arms cracked like breaking glass. "Wait," Jackson shouted, jumping to his feet and positioning himself between the hunters and Nyx. "Before anyone does anything permanent, can we just acknowledge how ridiculous this whole situation is?" Marcus kept his crossbow trained on Jackson. "Get out of the way, kid." "No. Seriously, think about it," Jackson continued, his voice taking on the same theatrical tone he'd used in the arcade. "You guys are professional monster hunters, right? Big, tough, probably have your own theme song and everything. And you're here trying to kill a teenage girl who's spent the last 5 years eating cafeteria salads and avoiding gym class." "She's a vampire," Derek said, but he sounded less certain than before. "She's a person who happens to be a vampire," Jackson corrected. "There's a difference. And if you can't see that difference, then maybe you're the real monsters here." The crossbow bolt meant for his heart whistled past his ear as Marcus pulled the trigger in frustration. But the shot never reached its target. Nyx moved faster than thought, her partially released power allowing her to disarm all 4 hunters in a blur of motion that left them stunned but unharmed. When the world stopped spinning, Marcus and his team found themselves zip-tied to trees with their own equipment, very much alive but very thoroughly defeated.
"How?"
Marcus demanded, struggling against his bonds. "She chose control over chaos," Jackson said, grinning at Nyx with something that might have been pride. "Turns out she's better at being a guardian than she thought." Nyx's eyes had returned to normal, the sealing marks on her arms glowing faintly but holding firm. She'd found the balance between her human and vampire sides, not by suppressing one or the other, but by choosing which one to be in each moment. "The authorities will find you by morning," she told the hunters, her voice calm and steady. "I suggest you reconsider your career choices before then." As they walked back toward town, leaving the defeated hunters to think about their life decisions, Jackson couldn't help but smile. "So," he said, "still think I'm going to regret getting involved in your supernatural drama?" Nyx was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. Then she bumped his shoulder with hers, and when she spoke, her voice carried warmth he'd never heard before. "Ask me again Monday, after we deal with whatever Madison and her crew have planned for the cafeteria." "Looking forward to it," Jackson replied, and for the first time since meeting her, He knew Nyx was too. The Ravencroft house sat at the end of Elm Street like something out of a gothic novel, all dark stone and towering spires that seemed to scrape the belly of the storm clouds gathering overhead. Nyx approached the front door with the reluctant steps of someone walking toward their own execution, knowing that the conversation waiting inside would determine whether she'd have a home to return to tomorrow. She'd texted Jackson 3 hours ago, "Need to talk to my family. We'll explain everything tomorrow." But she wasn't sure there would be a tomorrow, at least not the kind where she got to sit with him in the cafeteria and pretend to be a normal teenager with normal problems. The heavy oak door swung open before she could reach for the handle, revealing a woman who looked like an older, more severe version of Nyx herself. Elena Ravencroft had the kind of presence that made grown men confess their sins and teenagers immediately start planning their alibis. "Nyx," her guardian said, stepping aside to let her enter. "We felt the disturbance at the river. The sealing marks were activated. I can explain." "No need." A man emerged from the shadows of the hallway, tall and lean with silver threading through dark hair that matched Nyx's exactly. Marcus Ravencroft, not the hunter, but her uncle and the head of their family's supernatural guardianship. "We've been monitoring the situation since the school incident. We know about the hunters, and we know about your human friend." Nyx's stomach dropped. "Uncle Marcus, I can handle this." "Can you?" Elena asked, leading them into a sitting room where candles provided the only light, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with ancient books and artifacts that most museums would kill for. "Because from what we observed, you came dangerously close to breaking the seals entirely." "But I didn't," Nyx said, settling into the leather chair that had been hers since childhood. "I controlled it. I found the balance you always said was possible." Marcus and Elena exchanged a look that held entire conversations Nyx wasn't privy to. "The boy helped you maintain control," Marcus said finally. "It wasn't a question." "Jackson?" "Yes, he believes in me. He sees me as more than just a monster to be contained or a weapon to be feared. And because of that belief, you've attracted the attention of every supernatural tracker within 100 miles, Elena said, her voice gentle but firm. "The hunter you defeated tonight was using military-grade detection equipment. Word will spread." Nyx felt the familiar weight of isolation settling over her shoulders like a heavy cloak. "So, what are you saying? That I should disappear? Change schools again? Pretend this never happened?" "We're saying that your secret is no longer secret," Marcus replied. "The human world and the supernatural world are colliding around you, and that puts not just you at risk, but everyone you care about, including Jackson. Especially Jackson." Elena moved to the window, gazing out at the storm clouds that seemed to mirror the tension in the room. "Humans who know about our world, who involve themselves in our affairs, they rarely survive the experience unchanged. And not always in ways they would choose." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Nyx had seen what happened to humans who got too deep into supernatural politics. Some went mad from the knowledge, others were killed by creatures that saw them as threats, and a rare few were transformed into something no longer entirely human.
"So, you want me to cut him out of my life?"
"Go back to being alone." "We want you to consider what's best for both of you," Marcus said. "This boy has shown remarkable courage and loyalty, but courage won't protect him from what's coming. There are things in the darkness that make the hunters you faced tonight look like playground bullies." Nyx closed her eyes, feeling the sealing marks on her arms pulse with contained power. For the first time in years, she'd felt truly alive, truly herself. Jackson had given her that gift, the belief that she could be both vampire and human, monster and protector, feared and loved. "What if I don't want to hide anymore?" she asked quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. "What do you mean?" Elena asked. "What if I'm tired of pretending to be weak? What if I want to stand up, use my abilities the way they were meant to be used, and protect people instead of hiding from them?" Marcus leaned forward, his expression intense. "The seals were placed for a reason, Nyx. Your power fully unleashed. Could be exactly what this town needs," she interrupted. "You've been guardians for generations, protecting the balance between worlds. But you've been doing it from the shadows, cleaning up messes after they happen. What if instead we prevented them? With the human boy at your side. Elena's voice carried a note of something that might have been admiration. You realize what you're suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to trust someone outside our family. Maybe it's time to stop being so afraid of what I might become that I forget what I could choose to be. Thunder rumbled overhead, as if the storm itself was weighing in on the conversation. Marcus stood up, pacing to the fireplace where flames danced without any visible fuel. There would be conditions, safeguards. You would need training, real training, not just the basic control techniques we taught you as a child. You would both need training, Elena corrected. If this human is to be part of your world, he needs to understand what that means. The real dangers, the true stakes, the price that knowledge carries. Nyx felt something unfurling in her chest. Hope, mixed with determination and just a touch of fear. Are you saying yes? We're saying, Marcus said, turning back to face her, that perhaps it's time to stop seeing your nature as something to be contained and start seeing it as something to be guided. But Nyx, his expression grew serious. Once you make this choice, there's no going back. For either of you. Outside, lightning illuminated the windows, and for a moment, the room was bright as day. In that flash of clarity, Nyx saw her future spreading out before her, dangerous, uncertain, but no longer empty. I understand, she said, and I choose to move forward. Elena moved away from the window, her severe expression softening into something that might have been pride. Then we'll need to have a conversation with young Mr. Reeves. Tomorrow, after school. There are things he needs to know about the world he's choosing to enter. Will you tell him the whole truth? Everything, Marcus confirmed. The supernatural politics, the ancient feuds, the creatures that hunt in the spaces between human knowledge and vampire legend. If he's going to stand with you, he deserves to know exactly what he's standing against. As Nyx climbed the stairs to her room, her phone buzzed with a text from Jackson. Everything okay? Ready to face the cafeteria tomorrow. She typed back. Better than okay. We need to talk after school. Uncle Marcus wants to meet you. Should I be worried? Nyx smiled as she typed her response. Only if you're planning to back out now. Never. See you tomorrow, partner.
Partner.
The word carried weight now, implications and promises that went far beyond high school drama and cafeteria politics. Tomorrow, Jackson would learn the full truth about what he'd gotten himself into. And somehow, Nyx knew he'd still choose to stay. Monday morning arrived with a kind of crisp autumn air that promised change, and Jackson could feel it humming in his bones as he walked through Crestwood High's front doors. Students were already whispering about the weekend's events. Rumors about fire trucks at the arcade, mysterious explosions near the old river path, and the fact that Derek hadn't been seen since Saturday night. But the biggest change was walking beside him. Nyx no longer hunched her shoulders or tried to disappear into her black hoodie. She walked with the fluid confidence of someone who'd finally accepted what they were capable of, her dark eyes alert and aware of everything happening around them. The sealing marks on her arms were still there, but now they glowed with controlled power rather than desperate restraint. Ready for this? She asked as they approached the cafeteria doors. Are you? Jackson countered, noting the way several students stepped aside to let them pass. Word had spread about Saturday night, even if the details were confused and contradictory. More than ready, Nyx said, and her smile held just enough edge to remind anyone watching that she was no longer someone to be underestimated. The cafeteria felt different as they entered, charged with anticipation, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Conversations died as they made their way through the lunch line, and Jackson could feel hundreds of eyes tracking their movements. Madison was waiting for them. She stood near their old table, flanked by what looked like half the football team. Tyler was there too, sporting a black eye that suggested his weekend hadn't gone according to plan, along with several other students who'd made tormenting Nyx a recreational activity. But Madison herself looked different, desperate, almost frantic. like someone watching their social empire crumble and willing to do anything to shore up the ruins. Well, well, Madison announced loudly as Nix and Jackson approached, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent cafeteria. Look who decided to show up. The freak and her pet psychopath. Madison, Nix said calmly, settling at their usual table without a trace of the fear that used to define these encounters. Still trying to convince people you matter? The gasp that rippled through the cafeteria was audible. For 5 years, Madison had tormented Nix without a single word of resistance. This was uncharted territory. You think you're tough now? Madison's voice pitched higher, edged with hysteria. You think having your boyfriend cause some chaos makes you special? I think, Nix said, taking a deliberate bite of her apple, that you're boring. And bullies who are boring don't deserve my attention anymore. That's when Madison made her move. She grabbed Nix's lunch tray and upended it, sending food scattering across the floor in a recreation of that first day's humiliation. But this time, instead of cowering, Nix simply looked at the mess with mild interest. There, Madison declared triumphantly. Back where you belong, freak. Now, get down there and... She never finished the sentence. Jackson leaped onto the nearest table with theatrical flair, his arms spread wide like a conquering hero claiming new territory. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice booming across the cafeteria. Welcome to the Madison Collins Show, where the jokes are stale, the insults are recycled, and the entertainment value peaked sometime around middle school. The cafeteria erupted in laughter, but not the kind Madison was used to controlling. This laughter was directed at her, not with her, and she could feel her carefully constructed social power crumbling in real time. Get down from there, she shrieked. Why? Jackson asked, beginning an elaborate dance routine that looked like interpretive martial arts mixed with pure chaos. This is my territory now. I claim this cafeteria in the name of interesting people everywhere. More students were laughing now, phones were recording, and Madison supporters were beginning to edge away as they realized the social winds had shifted dramatically. But Madison wasn't finished. You want to dance, freak lover? She grabbed Tyler and 2 other football players. Let's dance. They rushed toward Jackson's table, but this time Nix was ready. She moved with inhuman grace, intercepting Tyler's charge with a precise movement that sent him sliding across the floor on a puddle of spilled milk. Her controlled strength turned his momentum against him, making it look almost accidental even as it demonstrated exactly how much she'd been holding back all these years. Jackson, meanwhile, employed what he called Uncle Eddie's anti-vampire combat techniques with devastating effectiveness. His unorthodox movements confused his attackers, turning their aggressive rushes into comedic pratfalls that had the entire cafeteria howling with laughter. When the biggest football player lunged for him, Jackson somehow managed to use the boy's own momentum to send him sliding under a table, where he became entangled with a trash can in a way that would be memed for weeks. Madison herself tried to tackle Nix directly, but found herself gently but firmly redirected into a chair, where Nix's supernatural speed allowed her to zip-tie Madison's shoelaces together so quickly it looked like magic. The entire fight lasted less than 90 seconds and resembled a carefully choreographed comedy routine more than actual violence. When the dust settled, Madison and her crew were scattered around the cafeteria in various states of embarrassment while Nix and Jackson stood calmly in the center of it all, completely unruffled. The applause started slowly, with just one student clapping. Then another joined in, and another, until the entire cafeteria was giving them a standing ovation. And that, ladies and gentlemen, Jackson announced with a theatrical bow, is how you deal with boring bullies. Thank you. Thank you. We'll be here all semester. Teachers arrived just as Madison tried to lunge at them again, only to slip on her own tied shoelaces and land in a cafeteria trash can with a sound that would be replayed on social media for months. As Principal Johnson separated the combatants and began demanding explanations, Nix caught Jackson's eye across the chaos. For the first time since he'd known her, she was truly laughing, not the careful, controlled sounds she used to make, but full-bodied, joyous laughter that transformed her entire face. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't afraid anymore. And with Jackson at her side, she finally understood what her uncle had meant about choosing what to become rather than accepting what others expected her to be. "So," Jackson said as they were escorted to the principal's office, "think this counts as a successful first week?" "Ask me again," Nix replied, her smile brighter than sunlight, "after we survive whatever Uncle Marcus has planned for your training tonight." "Training? Did I forget to mention that? You're about to learn everything there is to know about the supernatural world. Hope you're ready for advanced studies in monster hunting, protective wards, and interdimensional politics." Jackson grinned as they disappeared down the hallway, leaving behind a cafeteria full of students who would never again underestimate the pale girl with the dark eyes and her chaotic human partner.
"Best school ever," he said.
And for the first time in her life, Nix agreed.